Hi, this is my Linguistic 2000 final presentation. Throughout this class, Introduction to Linguistics, I have learned much about language production, sounds, and concepts relating to that. I have found that these are relatable to my future profession as an elementary school teacher, because that is where a lot of the fundamentals of linguistics begin. For my final project, I have chosen to incorporate both the language myths and the language files book and use it to my advantage and relate it to things that I will encounter in my future. The first myth that I have chosen to debunk is myth number 13, titled Black Children Are Verbally Deprived. This myth begins explaining the impact that African American speakers seem to have and the power that they elude in their voice. The myth addresses the deep oral roots and influences that African American language has, where its branches extend to every sphere of communicative activity within Black culture. But as the myth states, how ironic is it that young African American children are often described as verbally deprived, linguistically impoverished, or linguistically retarded? How are these two from the same culture, yet they have contrasting pictures of African American language? From the two, it seems that there is quite a distortion, but we do know that there is differences between African American talk, Anglo American talk, and so on. We are able to recognize these immediately. In the English language, there are many different language differences, and they are due to historical, social, and linguistic factors. As the myth states, when people from different cultures come together, the languages reflecting these cultures mix and adapt, but when groups are separated, they maintain and develop in different ways, thus enhancing language differences. Somewhere we see this often is within the classroom, especially in a kindergarten classroom where for many students it is their first time in a class setting. Now, more than ever, we see linguistically diverse children. Many of the myths that surround African American speech is due to the speech of a socially dominant group and the comparison to those. When compared to the middle class, Anglo Americans, the norm, of course, is going to be linguistically deficient. The book states that myths correlating racial and linguistic differences are easy to debunk. It gives a great example of if African Americans were raised in a different environment, such as Anglo American, they would sound indistinguishable from those in a surrounding speech community. And the same goes for Anglo Americans, raised in an African American environment. In an external educational article that was posted on a well-known journal site, a speech pathologist addresses the issue that is faced within schools regarding African American English. In the beginning of the article, she shares a time that she sat down with a young girl, 4 years old, homeless, and a heavy speaker of African American English. She listened to the speech pathologist, Julie Washington, read her a picture book titled, Are You My Mother? Afterwards, the young girl was asked to recount the story, and when she did, she says, Is you my mama? I ain't none yo mama. All in the dialect that she knew best. The story was shared within the article I found to be interesting. The young girl had to do a lot of work within her head to understand what the speech pathologist was reading to her, but then she also had to translate it into something that she was more familiar with. I would not consider that to be verbally deprived. A quote that comes directly from the article states that the experience convinced her that dialect was playing a significant and unrecognized role in the reading achievement of millions of children. In the educational field, a new concept is up and coming called code switching. Code switching is something that is not new, and linguists have been pioneering since the 1960s. Over the years, it has had at least half a dozen programs that have been implemented into schools. Most of them have only resulted in backlash. This is when a child begins to switch between their home dialect and the dialect that is spoken at school. In relation to myth number 13, Black children are verbally deprived, it is Language Files Chapter 10 and Language Variation. This chapter aligns well with Language Myth 13 because it shows the varieties, basics of sociolinguistics, and dialects. These all come together and paint a picture of African American language and why it is the way that it is. Sociolinguistics is the study of the relationship between these language varieties and the social structure, as well as interrelationships among different language varieties. Sociolinguists study many of the different varieties of language, including African American English. Throughout this chapter, in the book, we are introduced to many of the factors that go into speakers and their various dialects. Some of these include style and register, different slang and jargon, and overt and covert prestige. In conclusion to myth number 13, Black children are verbally deprived, we can see that Black children are not verbally deprived. All of the evidence shown here today indicates that Black children are a part of a powerful verbal culture which has verbal skills as the main value. But the social and political inequality that they face can lead to their different language perceptions they hold. As the book states, linguistically speaking, no one dialect or language is better, more correct, more systematic, or more logical than another. Rather, every language is a variety of a rule-governed system and effective means of communication. African Americans ought to be thanked for their contribution to daily conversation and their manners of speaking that enrich our lives and language.